Hi everyone and welcome to the second video about the 6 bishop e2 Taimanov. As I mentioned before in the previous video, I'm not a big fan of the regular way to play as white against knight f6. I think black gets a pretty comfortable game and a good version of the Scheveningen variation. However, the real problem lies in the move 7 bishop e3, which is a very serious way for white to fight for the opening advantage. After the move bishop e3, white's intentions completely change as he is now planning to start an attack with f4 and g4 and most of the time castle queenside. The right move for black here is to play bishop e7. Once again, try to stay flexible with that d-pawn as long as you can. Eventually it will go to d6 in these variations, but there is still some subtleties that you want to take into account when it comes to keeping the pawn on d7. For example, after g4 here, you'll probably be glad that you kept the pawn on d7 after h6. And let's say f4, it is now a very good move to play d5. First of all, if you take after knight takes, yes, you will end up with an isolated pawn, but at the same time, after knight takes d5, knight takes d5, black has the option of playing bishop h4 check, which is quite an annoying intermediate move, causing white problems to castle properly. So d5 is once again something you want to keep available as long as possible. Another way for white would be to play e5 knight d7, but even though I'm not much of a French fan myself, I never really played it as black. I think this is a pretty comfortable version. I don't think g4 is a particularly good move unless white has already had the option to castle queenside. Bishop h4 check is once again a threat, and black can continue with something like a6, knight takes d4, b5 and b4. And really I think with this premature g4 move inserted, this should give black decent play. One of the main ideas that I'll come back to later on in this line is that f5 is a very difficult move to get in as white, as the e5 pawn is attacked so many times. So once again, keep in mind we'd like to keep our d-pawn on d7 for as long as possible. However, the main move here is f4, after which we should probably go d6. Needless to say, now d5 I don't like as much. After e5 knight d7, white can simply castle short. He hasn't committed to g4, so that's a lot more attractive. And later on, after something like a6, queen d2, b5, for example, I think white could take on c6, play bishop d3, then get his knight to d4 and enjoy a pretty comfortable position, which really looks much more like a French defense than a Taimanov. So that's not something we really want to get into. d6, however, keeps it in the Sicilian spirit, and now white has several options available. Once again, g4 is a decent move, but as strange as it looks, I think d5 once again gives black some sort of decent play. The ideas are very similar. After ed, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, we have this bishop h4 check, so e5 would be the logical reply, but now after knight d7 and let's say h4, I think after a6, once again I believe that white is a bit too early pushing all these pawns, and after something like queen d2, b5, since he cannot castle short, I think black is getting a pretty decent position. I understand that it might not be to everyone's taste. I can understand that, but at the same time, I like these positions because they're a little bit unorthodox and they're pretty dynamic, so they do give you a good chance to play for a win. For example, here white could play a3, after which my continuation would be rook b8 with the idea of playing b4, and maybe rook takes b4. So one sample line could be if white changes on c6 and play bishop d4. Now I would take on b4 with the bishop and plan to play a5 followed by the typical bishop a6, changing off this bishop, which probably solves most of black's worries or problems in these types of positions. So this is something that I don't mind playing as black. that was about g4, which is not the most common move either way, and I believe it is because of d5. So yeah, that is a bit of a irregular way to handle the opening, playing d6 and then g4, d5, but it's quite a nice subtlety that you should keep in mind probably if you want to play this line. Another move would be knight db5. This is actually something that has been tried recently after queen b8, g4. Obviously d5 is no longer as tempting, so we should play a6 here, after which white should go back to d4 with the knight. And here I have a pretty interesting idea, which actually was played in that game that I was about to mention, which was, let me look it up, Hamdouchi against Sokolov in Nancy, in I think it was the French Championships in 2013. Black played this move e5, which generally is not a very good move because it allows knight f5, but because white has been making some strange decisions when it comes to playing knight b5, then going back to d4, playing g4 very early on, the general feeling towards, or the general feeling in which you should play this position is that it's a very, very concrete position, and sometimes you have to break rules in order to get a good position. In this case, black is planning to play e5 and open up the position with d5 very, very soon. So after knight f5, actually knight b3 was played in the game, and black was immediately better after a very strong move, d5, and e takes d5, e takes f4. It turned out that these complications heavily favored black after d takes c6, f takes e3. Even though white has opportunity to do something like queen d4 and long castle, I think the position was really bad when he lost his dark squared bishop, which is a very important piece in these positions. So knight f5 would be the next thing that a white player could try here, but once again I think black is no worse after bishop takes f5, g takes f5, and now the strong move b5, planning to sometimes play b4 in order to disturb this e4 pawn. As you might have seen in this video, we are getting into a little bit more of a theoretical territory, maybe more of a line where you would have to remember some lines. However, what I do like about this line is that it's fairly new. So for example, in this position no games have been played yet, and knight b3 was only seen before. So on one hand we do play a little bit more computerish, a little bit more sharp lines, and it's a bit more out of control. On the other hand, they're all fairly new, so that's sort of makes it more interesting to test them. After b5, white has several options, but I think the move rook g1 is the most logical out of all of them. You can have a look at the ebook for moves such as queen d2 and short castle, which is also possible. But rook g1 looks like the most sharp attempt by white to immediately attack this g7 pawn. Obviously g6 is not something you really want to play here, so black should castle short, and here white has the opportunity to win an exchange, which I personally don't mind at all, because after f takes e5, d takes e5, note that if white goes something like queen d2, there's b4 with some counterplay. If white decides to go knight a4, playing for the trick that here both knights are hanging, obviously you don't have to take on e4, but you can once again look into d5, which is a very strong counter-attacking move, and white is definitely in as much danger as black is here, so that's something you don't have to worry about. However, after f takes e5, d takes e5, bishop h6, it looks like we're in a bit of trouble, because obviously something like knight e8 is not something you want to play. First of all, there are some ideas related to bishop takes g7, but I guess knight d5 is what really looks very uncomfortable, and even after bishop h4 check, king f1, it looks to me like white has made a lot of progress and has some serious attacking chances and a very nice centralized knight on d5. So what I'm going to suggest is that you play the move g6, which is something that sometimes you have to do when you play the Sicilian defense. You have to sacrifice some material, and in this case, I think black enjoys full compensation after bishop takes f8, queen takes f8, as he has very serious control of the dark squares. The bishop can come to c5, the queen has some ideas of coming to h6, the rook will get into play fairly easily, and also the knight is very active, whereas the knight on f6 is already doing a very good job. So this position is something that I would like to go into. Yeah, you're an exchange down, you might not win the material back right away, but it's definitely something that that I don't think many white players would enjoy to play either. So I'm not afraid of that. And therefore, actually, I think knight b5 is an interesting move, but it's not exactly refuting the line either. It's just another interesting try. What is a very serious move is queen d2. Queen d3 doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Black can continue with short castles and later on continue with normal moves like knight d7, a6 and attack excuse me, attack that queen on c5 with knight c5 gaining a tempo. So queen d3 doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Queen d2, however, is the main move and probably the best one. After knight takes d4, which is the best move in my opinion, I try to play as quick and dynamic as possible. So as soon as white has moved his queen, it makes sense to take on d4 so he can take back in one move. Which we saw in the previous video, we could allow when white castled short, but since white's intentions are a lot more sharp here, we don't want to give him a lot of time for recaptures and so on. So after queen takes d4, castle, long castle, I have, as far as I know, still a novelty ready here, which is the move b6 once again, and I agree that it looks a little funny. Black's position looks somewhat suspicious, but I haven't been able to find any serious advantage here. For example, knight b5, queen b7, so excuse me, queen c6 might look a little strange, but white can't really use that diagonal as he has to defend his knight, and knight takes d6 would be the logical follow-up, but here black actually equalizes without too many problems after an exchange of the knight for the bishop and queen takes e4, and for example something like queen a3, knight d5 forces a bunch of exchanges after the following sequence, and the king will come to f7 and e8 or e7, specifically like the idea of playing something like king f7 and king e8, as it keeps the option of rook f7, whereas if white would give a check in these types of positions, his bishop might end up being a bit misplaced as the rook would like to enter on the c-file. Once again, this is not a position where you have a whole lot of winning chances, but it is equal, and as I said in several other positions that might look a little bit dry, I don't see any particular reason for white to go for these sorts of lines. So that should give you an idea as a black player that you shouldn't worry too much about it either, unless it's truly slightly worse, which is not the case here. So queen takes d4 is interesting, but after b6 I haven't been able to quite see how white gets an advantage. Another idea would be to play g4, but now once again, since white has already committed the long the queenside castle, I think d5 is a very interesting option. As in many of these other lines, e takes d5 isn't that worrying, because after bishop c5 in this case, queen d2, bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, bishop b7, bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, this is still hanging, and black will be able to recapture on d5 eventually with a normal position. For example, my line in the ebook continues something like this, where white tries to hold on to the pawn, but in the end black defends it enough times due to the pressure on the c-file where the knight couldn't move, otherwise it was a checkmate. And this rook endgame is completely equal, because black, even though black has this isolated pawn, at the same time these pawns here are a target, and black can go rook c4 fairly quickly. Also, his king shouldn't have any problems getting into the game. So just another example of how white could play, but it only leads to an equal endgame. So another idea would be knight b5, d5, g4, d5, e5, knight d7, but also here I think black has a reasonably decent version of the French defense where g4 is not necessarily such a handy move to have there because, as I said before, f5 is a very hard move to achieve and it could blockade white's attacking chances too. I think it's a bit far-fetched for white to aim for h4, h5, g4, g5, g6. Even if he gets there, oftentimes black is fine just taking on g6 and playing h6. And at the same time, black can think about creating counterplay, something like knight c5 and bishop a6, or maybe even the slow a6 b5 is something you can consider. So you can have a look at this position, but I think it's fairly okay for black. I think bishop takes d4 is maybe a bit more critical as it is the move that Peter Svidler played. Peter Svidler has made several videos for Chess24 as well, and he's a very strong theoretician and a very good player. So the game that he played I took as a main line, as I consider him to at least have some idea of what's going on here, and I think he did, even though in the game he didn't achieve much of an advantage. After e5, hold on, e5, white has several options. For example, bishop b5 check is a possibility, but after bishop d7 takes on d7, black has a very strong reply in sense of queen takes d7. Knight takes d7 will be answered by knight d5, so I don't like that too much. But queen takes d7 looks good to me, and after if white tries to take the pawn here, I think after queen e6 black has compensation. For example, first of all, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. Here this should be equal as both of these pawns are hanging. So black will win back his pawn, and after something like queen f4, I like the move knight h5, forcing an exchange of the queens, as white can only hold on to the bishop by playing queen f5. So the following endgame would arise, and once again black has very active play. Even though he's a pawn down, his rook will get into play very quickly, and after a short castle f6, already white should probably play the strange looking g4, as if he gives black the dark squared bishop, rook d2 will just come, followed by bishop c5, and black will actually end up having the better position. So g4, f takes e5, g takes h5, followed by bishop b4 is where I end my analysis. And even though black's a pawn down, I think the position is completely unclear. So after e5, I think the best move is bishop e3. Here we castle short. White generally castle short. If you go short castle, we almost transpose to a line that or maybe it is a direct transposition, I'm not sure, to the other video where white castles short to begin with. So we can probably take on f4 and play bishop e6, or again go for this interesting idea of b6, which I think both should be fine in this version. So long castle is really what white wants to do if he wants to test black's setup. Here we play a6. Well, knight b5, knight takes d6 was still an idea, and in this situation we can afford to play a6, so I advise you to do so. This has all been seen in games before, so we're just following theory here. G4 is the critical move. Very normal idea to sacrifice the pawn on G4 because knight D5 is always there with the tempo and it does open up the G file. So I wouldn't take on G4. I think that's a little bit too dangerous, at least to me. White has very good compensation there for the pawn. However, B5 seems to be alright to me. The idea being that after G5, an idea that you might be familiar with by now, the move B4 actually is very strong. It's a counter-attacking idea that prevents white from being able to put the knight on D5 without it being taken. So here black has a pretty decent counterplay. King B1 is the move that I focused most of my attention on, but also here I think this leads to positions where black is doing quite alright after B4, knight D5, knight takes D5, e takes D5, e takes F4, bishop takes F4, A5, and Well, it looks like a fairly normal Sicilian position to me. White does have a little bit of more space, but at the same time Black has some ideas on the queen side on the long run, and I think his king's position is fairly solid. I mean, he has no apparent weaknesses, and White is also quite far from advancing these pawns, so really I think this position is very close to equal. To give you a sample line, after g5, bishop f5, bishop d3, takes, rook ac8, Black can follow up with queen c4, exchanging the queens, and these endgames should be very double-edged as these three pawns might end up being targets. So that's about it for this line. I went through it a bit quickly because this is one of the larger analysis I made for the series. It's definitely one of the more critical lines in the repertoire I'm giving you. So if you want to study something, I would definitely suggest that this is something you might want to look a little deeper into. But as I said before, I have the feeling that Black does get decent counterplay, although it requires a bit more memory. And it does require another bit of flexibility as we've seen before. You have to allow yourself to get into some French positions, even though they're not exactly coming from a direct French opening. They are very similar, but at the same time, I think it gives Black versions of that opening that are very playable and not something that you have to shy away from. So I hope you still like this repertoire. Honestly speaking, in my experience, I haven't faced this bishop e3 move yet, and that's really because most of the white players like to play the bishop e2 system with short castle and so on. It doesn't happen too often that they are being forced into a line where they should castle queenside and actually completely change their approach of the opening compared to playing the regular bishop e2 lines. So once again, that's sort of a psychological advantage, and that's why I think you can play this line with a lot of confidence against many white players. So I hope you still like the line. Definitely study it a bit more if you're interested in it, and have a look at the ebook as usual. And I'll see you guys for some more lines such as the G3 line in the next videos. Thank you for watching.